faces after.
Perfect. So good morning, and thanks to everybody who is joining us here in the room at Brookings, and also to all of us, all who are joining us online. Welcome. I'm Samantha Gross. I'm the director of the Energy Security and Climate Initiative in Foreign Policy here at the Brookings Institution. And so climate change has become a really key issue in our politics. You might have noticed we have an election coming up, in international relations, in geoeconomics. And with everything that's happening now and how prominent the issue has become, it's easy to forget that only about 10 years ago, none of this was as clear. The New York Times and the Washington Post didn't have a climate desk, and many fewer people were thinking about this issue in their daily lives and in how they vote. I mean, few of us can forget Jim Emhoff's snowball, which happened prior to Paris back in 2014. But still, the issue has become so much more salient in the last 10 years or so. And I can think of two primary reasons for that. One of them is obvious. Climate change is happening. It's becoming more obvious to more people every day. I mean, we had two killer hurricanes come in through the Gulf of Mexico. One of them upending lives far from what we consider Hurricane Alley. That, my friends, is a hallmark of climate change. But I would say that the other reason that climate change has become so much more salient in the past 10 years is because of the ratification, the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Before this time, the world was sort of mired in this fundamental justice issue of climate. The wealthy world is responsible for the lion's share of emissions that have gotten us here. But there's no real success in dealing with climate possible without the whole world participating, including countries that are yet to develop. And so the Paris Agreement is a novel, creative framework that got the whole world together, bringing this founding principle of climate negotiations, of common but differentiated responsibilities, really into action, figuring out how to actually make that work for the 195 countries that signed on. It made the direction of global travel for climate change clear in a way that it just never was before, and cut back on some of the infighting that had been a hallmark of climate negotiations up until that time. So we have the perfect person here today to talk about where we are and how we got here with respect to international climate negotiations. I welcome Todd Stern. He is a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings in the Foreign Policy Program, and we're very grateful to have him. But the important part today is the 7 years that he spent as the U.S. Special Envoy for Climate Change at the U.S. Department of State in the Obama administration. Todd cut his political teeth way back in the Clinton White House and has been focused on climate change and international negotiations since 1997. He's seen a thing or two in terms of what's happened in the international climate space, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from him and his insights this morning. And then interviewing him and moderating the discussion is Sara Schonhardt. She covers the climate beat, especially the international negotiation space for E&E News. So I'm delighted to turn the stage over to them, and I look forward to listening to the conversation. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I am also delighted to be here. I'm really excited to talk about this book as someone who covers a lot of the ins and outs of international climate policy. This book offers a really behind-the-scenes look at the negotiation process. I mean, down to the phrasing of particular articles and the word choice. What motivated you to write it?
Well, so I think I decided to write the book for a few reasons, just as a backdrop, which obviously wouldn't have led me to write the book by itself. But I always like to write. I wrote lots of articles and op-eds and speeches and things like that. And so the idea of writing a book was always somewhere in the back of my mind if a topic came up that seemed like it worked. And by the time we got through Paris, I definitely felt that that was the case. I mean, the people have referred to Paris as the Paris Agreement as the most important international agreement in the 21st century and one of the most important in the last 100 years. And I think that's probably right, given the magnitude of climate change. So, and I had not just a bird's eye view, I had an operational participating view in everything that happened. So, so I thought it would be interesting, and I thought it would be I didn't write this as a comprehensive history, but that it would be useful to history to get my thoughts down on paper. So that's why I did it.
Well, I found it quite useful. I do wonder, in the years since the Paris Agreement has been signed, and I suppose this is true throughout the history of the negotiations, there have been critics who say this is a long and laborious process, that it's not binding, that
Right.
it just hasn't worked, and really the structure of it isn't workable. It can't work to achieve the goals that we need to
Right.
achieve. Is this book in any way a response to that criticism?
Well, look, I think that there were certainly people who criticized the notion that that it wasn't binding in certain ways, and gee, it should have been, and that kind of thing. There were plenty of sort of naysayers when the agreement was done. Hailed all over the world, but you had some of those voices, and my sense about that was always, that's great, except that was not possible. I mean, you've got politics and the international kind that we call diplomacy is always the art of the possible, and there was no chance to get an agreement that was completely binding. Paris is structured in interesting ways, as Samantha alluded to. It is partly legally binding and partly not. So the emission reduction targets that countries submit are not, but all sorts of rules in the agreement, such as the transparency rule. What do countries have to do about reporting on what they're doing, and how does the international review of their reports, how's that done, and do they have to submit new targets every X number of years and so forth. So there's a lot of things that are binding and some things that are not, and the biggest reason for that probably is the United States, because if this agreement had come back in a form that required it to be approved by the Senate under the Constitution, Article 2 of the Constitution, the advice and consent clause, which says that you need 2/3 of the Senate to approve agreements if they check certain boxes, then there would have been no chance to get this done. And that was, I would have been sure of that under any circumstances, but I didn't have to guess, because that's what happened in the 1997 agreement in Kyoto, the so-called Kyoto Protocol. If you go all the way back, the original, the sort of granddaddy treaty in climate change is the Framework Convention in 1992, which was a framework. So it didn't get down to brass tacks. Countries realized early on that was needed. The first effort was Kyoto. Kyoto was structured in exactly the kind of way that required Senate confirmation. The U.S. negotiators in Kyoto said yes, but there was not a chance in hell for that to happen. And so if I came in with one conviction to this job, it was that we were not going to do an agreement that the U.S. said yes to and then couldn't join. That was not going to happen. So that's where we got.
That's where we landed.
Yeah.
I do want to come back to the U.S. role, but I also want to talk about the role of the COP president.
Yeah.
This came up in your intro chapters, where you talk about Copenhagen and the Copenhagen COP. And in that case, you write that a strong president wielding the gavel leads the hall rather than getting led by it. How important is the host country and the president of the proceedings?
Well, I think very important, and not just for in a situation like that, but a good presidency, a good host, but again, not just hosting, but the president of the COP, is able to bring countries together to listen to to kind of what the priorities are on all different groups. There's 195 countries, and by the way, the decision practice in climate change is that there has to be consensus. So you sort of have to have all of those 195 countries on board. It's like a very, very difficult task. The countries are kind of grouped in various different blocks and groupings and with quite different priorities. So a really good presidency, the French were excellent in 2015, is able to hear from everybody, able to try to see, okay, they're here, is there a way to try to find a solution that works? So that's super important. The Danish presidency was enormously important in what happened in that much maligned but actually quite important COP in 2009. And then it also includes things like, you know, you're up at the podium in the final session, the final so-called plenary session with all countries there, and in Copenhagen, there was a kind of revolt on the floor. It would not have been easy for anybody, but I think at that point, the Danish prime minister was somewhere between exhausted and something else. He was having a difficult time dealing with some extremely difficult countries at that point.
This year's host is Azerbaijan, and they were actually selected rather late in the process, so they haven't had much time to prepare. This is a pretty difficult round of climate talks ahead of us. They're talking about finance, which you also address in the book. Do you have any concerns, or how do you feel they might handle some of these really difficult issues?
You know, I don't really know yet. They have asked me to be part of an international advisory committee, so I'm actually going to be going there in a few weeks. I have heard some fairly positive things about the Azerbaijanis. They're certainly not a country that is well experienced in climate. So, and there's one particular issue that's going to be very difficult to wrestle to the mat, and I think that they will not have a kind of, you know, lead the group capacity the way the French did, and the French were unusual in that regard. But I have heard some relatively good things about what they're doing so far, but I think it'll be a challenge.
What's the particular issue that they are going to need to wrestle with?
Well, the biggest issue this year is climate finance, a piece of climate finance. So go back to 2009, the Copenhagen conference, and there was a big push and ultimately agreement on for developed countries to mobilize $100 billion a year for assistance to developing countries by 2020. And mobilize means it doesn't all have to come out of your coffers. It can be it can be a result of governments providing certain kinds of mechanisms to encourage the private sector to put in to invest. But so that went to 2020. In Paris in 2015, there was an agreement to keep that $100 billion a year going to 2025, and then to re-up it with a floor of $100 billion. So it was going to be more than $100 billion. There have since been any number of reports talking about all the things that the world needs to do with respect to climate change to help developing countries. By the way, developing countries, there's a huge range in that broad term of developing countries, and in the climate change context, developing countries means a list of countries that was identified in 1992 and hasn't changed, not because people on the developed countries side want that, but because powerful players on the developing country side won't let it evolve. So you have countries like China, most famously, who was about maybe half the size or less than that of U.S. emissions way back in 1992, is now more than double U.S. emissions and is 30% of the world's emissions, and much wealthier than they were back then. And there are a number of other countries like the UAE and others that are, are hardly poor. But you still have this, they're all in the developing country block, and nobody has, there's no capacity to change that. So now I've gotten off on the developing country block. So I guess what we're talking about finance. You have now this imperative of coming up with a new number beyond 100 billion. And there has, I guess I started to say, there have been all sorts of reports talking about what the world needs to do with respect to climate change, with respect both to building clean energy economies all over the world. In other words, not fossil fuels, but wind and solar and so forth. As well as building resilience in countries that are particularly vulnerable. So you have estimates that range from you need $1 trillion a year, you need $2 trillion a year, you need $2 trillion, but half of that should come from the developing countries' own domestic resources. All sorts of reports like that, but the numbers are big. Mm-hmm. Those numbers were not ginned up with the thought that those are the replacement for that specific $100 billion pledge. So I think the challenge now that countries, and certainly the U.S. but other developed countries are wrestling with right now is that in what to me was a very predictable way, once big $1 trillion numbers got put down, when we got to this point of the successor number, developing countries would say it's got to be $1 trillion or $2 trillion or whatever, which is simply not happening in the context of what developed countries can promise.
Right.
So that's a hard issue. I think what they're trying to do right now, or people there are trying to do, some countries are trying to do, is to separate out what's the right number to succeed the 100 billion in what it was doing, sort of the inner layer, and what is an outer layer of finance to think about from all sorts of different sources, like the World Bank and the multilateral development banks and national development banks and so forth. And so this is going to be what this COP is most about. There'll be other issues that are dealt with, but this is going to be the heart of it.
Relatedly, and I guess back to your point about the differentiation between developed and developing, you talk about that quite a bit in the book, and highlight how the Paris Agreement made some effort to break down this firewall, as you refer to it, by getting all countries to set their own national climate plans based on their capabilities, so that there's no distinction between developed and developing. And yet, this developing paradigm still exists quite strongly within the negotiations, and I think this year will again come up in the context of who contributes, who receives money. How do you begin to get around that?
Well, the notion of differentiation still exists, and there still are these two categories of countries. But it's pretty dramatically different from what it was when we first, the Obama administration, first started working on this in 2009. So there really is not a firewall in the firewall. The term firewall was a term that actually used by negotiators themselves, and so go all the way back to Kyoto, which sort of entrenched that more than anything else, and that meant that all obligations in the Kyoto Protocol having to do with countries reducing their emissions and taking all sorts of actions consistent with that, a transparency system, reporting and review and so forth, all of that was for developed countries only, not developing. And even the mandate to negotiate the Kyoto Protocol, which was called the Berlin Mandate, agreed to in 1995, specified that this is only about developed countries taking action. Developing countries are a totally different category. That was the firewall. That started to get chipped away at actually in the Copenhagen conference in 2009. That was the first time, and an example of that chipping away was that there was an understanding before the Copenhagen Accord got finished that developed countries would put forward on a non-binding basis what they were planning to do, and developing countries could decide for themselves whether they were going to do it or not. But before we ever entered into that, we knew that all the major developing countries were agreeing to do that. So, and once they put that forward, it had the same level of, it wasn't binding for them or for us, but it was understood that countries were supposed to get that done. So you had really kind of every aspect of what countries had to do were separated. That's really not the case by the time you get to Paris. And not all in one fell swoop, but it's sort of bit by bit. On the other hand, as you say, those categories still do exist. They very much exist in the minds of countries. They very much exist in the context of finance and various forms of assistance. And I think that, the best chance to get well past the kind of acrimonious tone that has been in climate negotiations for a long time, maybe a little less now, but not that much less, would be to really conquer this finance problem, which is hard. And by that again, I don't mean just the successor to the $100 billion, which is going to have to get fought through this year, but the kinds of deep reform to the financial system that has been taken on by the G20, and really in the last 3 G20 meetings, and most clearly in the Indian G20 last fall, where a very good report called the Triple Agenda was prepared at the Indian request by a famous Indian economist and by Larry Summers, who was a famous American economist and former Treasury Secretary and so forth. And they did a really important, really good report talking about how you can get to much bigger numbers in these kinds of ways. It will take a lot for that sort of report to get taken up, yeah. But that's the direction, in my opinion, that things need to go.
It is a huge topic, and in fact, you talk about how the best hope of evolving this Paris process is by making progress on solving finance. Obviously, right. That includes a lot more than just negotiations, right. But because it is a central issue, we've heard from some officials we've spoken with that there's a real potential risk of failure. I guess there's always a potential risk of failure out of these negotiations, but what happens if the finance discussions this year don't make progress?
Oh, I think if so, the way things would work is, again, you have to get decisions have to get made. So text that's been negotiated in a given COP, and in this case this would be a key part of that, has to be adopted for it to be to become an official part of the process. And failure would be essentially you can't get anything that people are agreeing to, and so it just rolls over to the next year. I mean, if that were to happen over and over again, you would have a UNFCCC process, that's the negotiating body, in real trouble. I think if it happened, this one time, in ways it happened in Copenhagen, but life went on, and there was a very, again, the Copenhagen Accord, which was ultimately negotiated, not adopted, because there was a revolt by about 10 or 15 countries in the final meeting. It was not adopted with a lot of work by those of us trying to keep it alive. It was taken note of, which is a UN, one of these odd UN phrases, but which meant essentially that it's not dead. It's not adopted, but it's kind of still there. You could still kind of refer to it and stuff. And it became the centerpiece of the negotiations the following year, and basically all the substance was adopted. So we kept it alive, and then it made a difference. So I think if this effort to get the successor to 100 billion were to fail, and I don't think that's going to happen, I think they will cobble something together, and there'll be lots of people who are a little bit satisfied and quite a bit unsatisfied, but it'll still get done, I think. If it doesn't, that will reflect badly on the state of the what I sometimes refer to as the Paris regime. But it won't. Again, it won't fall apart. I mean, it won't even be like there's a chance of something happening here on November 5th that would be much more serious than that.
I'm going to come back to that point too. I'm going to get through two more questions. Just on is there someone that you see being able to come in and try and rescue the talks? In Copenhagen, there were a few people. Ed Miliband sort of rose to the fore. Are there officials or particular countries you see as emerging to try and lead the way?
Well, you always sort of start with the United States, China, and the EU. Those are the three biggest players. And in Copenhagen, it was, Ed Miliband from the UK played a big role. The US was completely central to that. And there were a bunch of other countries. So I think here, China has a great capacity to bring along other developing countries. So if you find a way forward with China, you're probably going to find a way, most of the way forward. You're probably not going to have a lot of developing countries in the last analysis saying no if China says yes. The U.S. will either be very important or less important because right in the I guess it's not in the middle, it's a little bit before the conference starts. We have our election. And if Trump is elected, then the U.S. kind of voice will be greatly diminished. But it will still sort of, it'll still be a player in trying to figure out what needs to happen, but much less of one. So I would say then you'll see a lot more from the EU, UK, and then others on the developing country side will certainly have a voice. But I mean, the player in a way that will be most significant then is Brazil, because Brazil is the host next year.
Yeah.
And Brazil is also a country with a very, very sophisticated foreign service, one of the very best in the world. I always thought Brazil and Singapore were the two countries with the most impressive group of civil servants.
On China, the U.S. and China cooperation has really helped facilitate a lot of these negotiations. In particular, in 2014,
Right.
the U.S. and China agreed to jointly release their national climate plans, which really kickstarted a lot of the Paris process. And you write at length about that. Is that possible this time around? Both countries are also on the cusp of having to set new climate plans. Could they do that again? Would that move the needle?
Could they? You mean could they cooperate in the way that we did before?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is, I think to some extent the answer is probably not quite the way we did before, but there's a real imperative that I think both John Kerry, when he was leading the show in this Biden presidency, and now John Podesta after Kerry left, have spent a lot of time trying to work cooperatively with the Chinese. I think what that relationship during the 7 years of leading up to Paris, that bilateral relationship, I think, was pretty clearly the most important in the world. We never easily agreed with the Chinese, but there was, particularly in 2009, the Chinese kind of resisted till the bitter end and ended up feeling that they had, I think, not done well in their own eyes, and most importantly because they got crosswise with poor and vulnerable countries, which they really don't like to do, and got into too much public dissonance with the U.S. And I think they were pretty focused on not having that happen in the future, and so their positions on issues were always different, and this underlying issue of differentiation, like what do developing countries have to do compared to what do developed countries have to do, just ran through the negotiations, has always run through the negotiations all the way back, to the 1990s. And again, that moderated and changed a lot over time, but always against Chinese resistance. But with some understanding on the Chinese part that they could move a little this way and they could still sort of maintain what they needed, and bit by bit, again, as I said before, it really moved a lot, but that effort to, the first time I met my counterpart was Xie Zhenhua, and I met with him for the first time in March of 2009, and right away I said to him that I thought he and I should try to have the U.S. and China climate relationship be a positive pillar in the overall relationship, which was not as strained then, the overall, as it is now, but it was pretty difficult.
Yeah.
There was basically every other issue you could talk about with respect to the South China Sea, the Dalai Lama, economic behavior was very, very difficult. So it really did turn out to be the case that climate change became an issue we could make progress on. And if you fast forward to the Paris talks, and the first day of the conference was the day when leaders came, and so President Obama had 3 meetings that he did. And one was with China, one was with India, and one was with a group of poor island countries. And in the meeting with President Xi, she said, like, right away that climate change had become a bright light or something like that in the relationship, which was kind of the objective from the beginning, and that allowed us to make progress. I think now it's definitely harder, and I think among the climate people on both sides, actually, there is some desire to work semi-constructively together, but the degree to which that'll be possible, you can't completely separate it from the larger relationship. And I mean, to make the most obvious example, if there turned out to be actual conflict over Taiwan, you're not going to make a lot of progress anywhere else. And there's all manner of other less dramatic tensions that make this hard. So my view is you've got to try to do this. It's more important than ever to have some element of the relationship that's more positive. And the issue itself, meaning climate change, is so central and so is such a fundamental problem for the world that you sort of have to get the two 800-pound gorillas working together.
Right. But you do think that
I think
the
there's
ability to cooperate has maybe become more difficult.
more difficult, but not impossible. And again, Kerry got some things going, and Podesta is following those up. So it's not the case that there's nothing going on right now. There are various issues that they've agreed to try to work on, and one of them is methane, which is another. CO2 is the biggest, most important greenhouse gas, but methane is actually really, really important, and so that's an area, and there are a few areas where they are trying to work together.
We have a couple of minutes left between us, and then we'll
Okay.
open it up to audience questions. So I want to get to the elephant in the room, which is November 5th. You mentioned it being important. How important do you think it will be for these negotiations, which start just days later?
Do you mean for this year?
Yes, the
Yeah.
U.S. elections.
Well, I think it will certainly be very important. It will put a complete damper on the entire negotiation. I mean, there will be if this happens, there will be, I think. I mean, remember, countries have been through this before with us, and Trump came in 2017, and in short order declared that he was going to pull the U.S. out of the agreement, and this, again, remember that this is an agreement where lots of countries had agreed to do certain things that they didn't really want to do in terms of different provisions in the negotiations, because the U.S. needed it, because the U.S. would not have been able to join without certain of these provisions. And then in short order, the U.S. is out. So you had a lot of upset, understandably. On the other hand, nobody left. All the countries stayed in. They kept working away. I mean, there was actually a specific thing you had to work away on, which came to be called the Paris Rule Book. So it's quite common in agreements like this. You have, let's say, 2 or 3 pages in the agreement that spell out, generally, with some specificity, actually, how the transparency system is supposed to work. But then you have 15 pages of guidelines to go through the nitty-gritty, and that stuff had to get done. And it did get done. It even got done with some assistance from the U.S. side. I mean, on that specific issue of transparency, there were 2, what in the climate world are sometimes referred to as facilitators, so one developed, one developing, which is a common way to do business, to run meetings and to try to listen to what people are saying and to try to push in some kind of constructive direction. And the 2 facilitators on transparency had been one Chinese guy and one American guy, and they from the State Department, and election or no election, they just kept working and produced a really important piece of the rule book. So, but I think that you will have a lot of frustration, a lot of disappointment. The U.S. will lose its voice at anything other than a pretty technical level. I mean, the U.S. negotiators will still be there. They can still say, if we did it this way rather than that way, that would open the door. And U.S. negotiators are very good and very experienced, and have a lot of respect from the community. So I don't think that their voices would mean nothing, but they would not mean there's like no political sort of force behind what we're saying at that point. So I think it would be quite bad. I think that there would probably be some resolution to the finance issue we were talking about, but that could be made worse. And then, longer range, it's bad.
Yeah, that was my follow-up is beyond this year.
Yeah.
What potential impact do you see?
Well, so I mean, there's looking at the documents that get negotiated in the Paris regime itself, and then there's also looking at what goes on outside of that, like what goes on in countries who are countries going to be making progress, like rapid progress in moving away from fossil fuels and moving toward clean energy, et cetera, or not. And I think that once you kind of pull the U.S. out of certainly the international climate regime, my guess is this would be true for most any important international thing that you were trying to do. The U.S. is just a huge player. I mean, Madeleine Albright, our first woman Secretary of State in the 1990s, famously referred to the U.S. as the indispensable nation. And, you know, in my experience, which is limited to the climate side of things, that's pretty apt. You just don't, you have force when the U.S. is in there pushing in one direction or another. If you have the U.S. and China, you have force on sort of the two biggest blocks of countries. Europe is certainly important, but, you know, the EU is a group of 28 countries. It's really hard to come to decisions, really hard in the context of negotiations, where being nimble and able to go to say this, we were here, but if we went here and here, we can make some progress. Well, they've got all sorts of problems because they figured out in advance, they had agreement that they would do this, but not this and this. Mm-hmm. So they just can't move nimbly in a way that's super useful and important in the negotiations. So if you don't have the U.S. there, it's just like you've thrown a party and one of the big players in the party didn't show up, and it's kind of like a bit of a downer in the whole, you know, there's like less energy and oomph in the whole system. So that would be a longer range thing. And I suppose that, you know, what would happen is that countries will do their best, but again, be looking for the U.S. to kind of come back into it. But like losing 4 years when you're dealing with climate change is like a really serious thing.
So do you think the world can survive a Trump 2.0?
You know, I think that the world will survive a Trump 2.0 if it happens, because we're not going to have any choice. But like on the more positive side of things, there is a momentum now in the world of clean technology that's not going to stop. I mean, the push toward solar and wind and batteries and electric vehicles and heat pumps for homes and all of that kind of stuff, not to mention the newer technology that is still trying to figure out and will figure out over some period of time how you deal with the heavy industrial sector. What about steel? What about cement? What about chemicals and so forth? Those efforts are going to go on because people around the world do think and will continue to think that this is the future. And this is like a really bad bump in the road. I mean, we had a really bad bump in the road, and we thought we got over that. Now we have a second bad bump in the road, but they're not going to stop doing that, and U.S. companies are not going to stop doing it if they are at all sensitive to their own futures. I mean, you can't suddenly. I mean, Trump might say we don't need electric vehicles, but if the U.S. car makers were to sort of stop on that program, they'll just get beat bad they'll get knocked out of the competitive game. Yeah. So you're going to have a lot of this that's going to go on anyway. You also had, in the IRA, the big climate legislation that the Biden administration did. Very wisely, there's been hundreds of billions of dollars of investment already triggered by the IRA. A lot of it with government money, but a lot of it then the government money pulls in private money on top of it. So, and guess what? Lots of the actual facilities that have been built for renewable energy or electric cars, whatever it might be, have been located in red states, not accidentally. And so you look at Texas, you look at the Plain States, you look at even West Virginia, you see people starting to profit from businesses starting to profit, workers starting to have jobs, and it's not going to be so easy for Republicans to suddenly cut that off. And so I think a lot of this is going to keep going forward, but not with the momentum that it would if Harris is elected. because it's always true that policy drives action. And so you'll have no good policy coming out, that's for sure. And you'll have some attempt to give even more benefit to fossil fuels and to undo some of what Biden did. But they're not going to be able to undo it all, and Republicans aren't going to want them to. And there's tax credits that last for, I think they were originally for 10 years, so there's a bunch of years left in that. And once you give somebody a tax credit, they don't want you to take it away. They don't care what party you're in. So it'll be bad, but it'll be sort of, well, it'll be bad because it'll be bad because any loss of speed.
Yeah.
We're going to do what you. So the thing you have to understand with respect to climate change is, and the green transition is, that's happening. It's going to happen. It's just that if it happens 25 years from now rather than 10 years from now, whatever, it's a race against time. I mean, it's a race against increasing global temperatures that are causing the huge. I mean, I know I'm supposed to finish this answer, but just to give a very broad, quick take on how I look at the overall climate landscape now, I see three major factors. One is that the science and the impacts, what we see out the window, the biblical weather we're seeing all over the world, worse and faster than anybody anticipated. So it's coming at us worse and faster than we thought. The clean energy revolution, as I've already said, has been spectacular. I mean, really spectacular in the last 10 years, and much more, like way more than even the most sympathetic analysts had predicted. But we still have these big obstacles, and the big obstacles mostly called the fossil fuel industry, both with respect to what they do and maybe even more with respect to the influence they have. So those are the factors, and now I'll give the floor back to you.
Well, I do want to give everyone in the audience time to ask questions. So we have a mic going around. If you have a question, happy to call in you from the audience. You can continue to monopolize my time. Yeah, right in the back.
Hi there. I just wanted to go back to that idea you were talking about for the new collective quantified goal and the inner layer and outer layer ideas, kind of how you can get to the substance of a replacement numerical goal and accept kind of all of the wider enabling changes to international financial institutions that we need to get to the bigger numbers that we all know are needed. What actions do you think major developed countries can take running into the negotiations that can really make that a reality? And is there a coalition of parties going into the COP that could really make that succeed?
Sorry, can you also just introduce yourself, just so we know who you are?
Sorry, I'm Sam Sherburn from the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero.
Great, thank you.
So I know there's thinking along these lines. My guess is there are coalitions that exist now. I'm not engaged in the negotiations themselves, so I can't say exactly who is working with who. But I think the U.S. is certainly thinking along these lines. I think that inevitably countries in Europe will be also. The U.S. tends to be very close with Japan and Australia and others. So my guess is that the sort of basic structural issue that we're not going to agree to like $1 trillion here because we can't possibly, because nobody will deliver on it, and then everybody will be mad because we're not delivering, so we can't go there. So like, how do we think about this? And I think from my point of view, the notion that they've tried to sort of put this in two buckets makes sense, because like, you can't get that huge number here. Let's talk about what we can get here. It's got to be more than 100. We know that. So what is it? And I literally don't know what numbers are getting talked about kind of internally. But I think that as a sort of basic notion makes a lot of sense. I think that with respect to what I refer to as an outer layer, that's something that would, I mean, in my view, again, I don't know what they're talking about per se, but I don't think that would happen with sort of as an output of the UNFCCC negotiations. That, if it were to happen, would happen much more in venues where there's strong financial expertise, like the G20, and where you already have, I think the last 3 G20s really have all focused a lot in different ways, but have all focused a lot on this finance question. I don't know, the Brazilians are actually the host of the G20 this year. I don't know what they're going to do with respect to moving this along, but if they're, so let's go back for 1 second to the triple agenda that I alluded to from India, that document. If you were going to have pretty radical reform of the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks, the only way that happens is if the major shareholders of those institutions push it. So that means, first and foremost, the United States. So as I think about this, the requirements would be Harris has to win. Harris then has to be persuaded, probably in the context of the transition, that this is a big damn deal, that this would be a big legacy issue for her, that is quite crucial to moving the system, the climate system forward. And then you would also have to see whether we have a World Bank president who's prepared to radically change the culture of the institutions. I think Ajay Banga is quite a smart guy, quite a good guy. He replaced somebody who was not, who didn't think climate change actually practically even existed. So Banga is a smart guy. He was very successful at MasterCard. I think a lot of people respect him. Whether he's prepared to be a serious activist, he has not been so far, but he hasn't been getting, my guess is he figures, I'm not going to stick my neck out if I don't have the shareholders behind me. So Harris wins, you get the shareholders lined up, and then you see whether Banga is somebody that can be worked with. And all of that seems to me to be possible, but each step of that way is challenging. But my view, it's got to go in that direction.
I think I saw another hand in the back.
Hi, I'm Peter Colohan. I'm from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. And I just wanted to see if you can comment on 2 things. Perhaps the intersection between UNFCCC, the COP for climate, and the biodiversity COP.
Yeah.
I wonder if we do a lot of work in land conservation, the financing of land conservation, the financing of interventions for climate. And I wonder if you could just comment on that. And then the second question I have is about monitoring, measurement, reporting, and verification, MMRV, and the technologies for that. We do some work in that space as well. If you could just comment on what you think is the most important or salient thing for policymakers about the hugely technical question of measuring the environment.
Yeah, so 2 good questions. On the second one, I think that the kind of mechanisms, the language that's put in place for what countries need to do in terms of actually reporting and getting reviewed, I think that's pretty good from Paris and then from the rule book that followed. My guess is, and I'm not technical here, but my guess is that the capacity, and we're pretty close, I mean, you can tell me probably, we're pretty close to having this if we don't have it already, but the capacity at a satellite level to be able to get, to look like all the way down to like what plants are producing what emissions, I think is in this area pretty revolutionary. And so if you're worried about whether it's China or the United States or the EU or India or anybody, whether what they're reporting is accurate, in pretty short order, if not already, I think not quite already, but in pretty short order, there should be a capacity to say, okay, so China, you said you're emitting this much. Actually, it's this much because we've got it right here. And I think that's actually hugely important because this is all a game about controlling and reducing emissions. I'm sorry. Now, what's your first question again? Oh yeah. So I don't have a lot to say about that. It's interesting. I mean, I know it's obviously a very important area. They're very linked together because there's lots of causes for biodiversity, but climate change is a big one. You know, if the Amazon keeps burning, if the Amazon is one of, you know, there's such a thing as in the science world called tipping points. Everything that we've experienced so far, which has been, as I referred to before, kind of biblical weather, that's all linear. That's all. It's getting a little bit worse, a little bit worse. Tipping point is like, think of the game, what's it, Jenga, whatever it's called, where you're building up and you've got all of these. Anyway, we can forget about me trying to explain that game, but you get to a point where you suddenly things just fall off the edge, and that's the Amazon is one of the places where there's a risk of that. At a certain point, it gets so bad that it turns into a savanna rather than a forest, which would have an incredible effect on biodiversity. I spoke. I've been running around speaking. My book came out on October 8th, so I've been doing a lot of talking to folks. And one of the places I was at was the Watson Institute at Brown, which is their foreign policy and I guess overall policy institute. And one of the students in the audience said, "Well, shouldn't we combine the biodiversity COP, the biodiversity regime, and the climate regime?" And my first answer was, well, I don't know, but that doesn't sound like it's a good idea because they're already so complicated. And that gut answer is either right or wrong. And I mean, what's true is that there should certainly be, I think, probably more interaction than there is now. And I mean, if you care about these issues, you've probably read Elizabeth Colbert's book on the sixth extinction, and so it's like one of the really, really important, importantly bad outcomes of climate. Although again, not only climate. So I don't know if they should. My gut is that they're so complicated right now, and they work differently, that you'd spend years trying to get them to actually, work as one, but working more closely seems to me to make sense.
Do we have time for one more question? Yeah? Sure.
Hey, hello. Thank you for your talk. My name is Chris Lynch. I'm a student from Dartmouth College. I just wanted to return to what some of your points at the end, talking about this nature of the race against time. I think, as you mentioned, this is a really critical decade. The IPCC understands that 2025, for like a 1.5 aligned pathway, is supposed to be the year of peak global emissions, and the United States has some key goals, such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50% compared to 2005 by 2030. And I think it's really amazing to see the effectiveness of these voluntary goals set by NDCs. But I wanted to ask, what kind of impact do you think, if critical nations such as the United States fail to meet these goals in coming COPs in coming years, what kind of impact do you think it'll have on the negotiating environments, especially as developing nations in the global south continue to face worsening impacts and intense displacement?
Well, look, I think that I think making pledges is one thing. Keeping them is I mean, if people make pledges and they don't do much about it, then that's the thing that would ultimately erode the value of the Paris Agreement. I don't at all agree with people who say, well, emissions are still going up, so Paris isn't working. It doesn't quite work that way. But if countries are making pledges and then not doing them, that's different. Now, so the U.S. made a pledge to reduce roughly 50% emissions by 2030. I don't think we're going to quite get there, although I think we'll probably be close. I think if we're close, and I think the whole target process is going to be front and center in the 2025, the upcoming year. Because so targets in the lingo of the climate negotiations are referred to as NDCs, nationally determined contributions. So the next round, there are cycles. Every 5 years, countries are supposed to put up new ones, and the new ones are supposed to be better than the old ones, and indeed are supposed to be at a country's, I think it's highest possible ambition is what the Paris Agreement says. So 2025 is the next year. The 2025 targets will last until 2035. 2035, then, if you fast forward in your mind to 2035, that's getting pretty damn close to 2050, where some of the big core goals are oriented around. So one of those goals is to be something like net zero emissions by something like 2050. Maybe not exactly either one, but close. If we look at the 2025 NDCs, remember, out to 2035, and they're weak, that's going to be a really bad signal. I think you're going to see strong action. My guess is strong action from the U.S., the EU, Japan, Australia, Korea maybe. Korea's a developing country, but they're quite advanced. I think that what the Chinese do is going to be super important because, again, they're 30% of emissions. And if they sort of say, well, and they're basically peaking about now, maybe next year, maybe last year, but they're more or less peaking around now, which is a very good thing. But then they've got to not sort of ride a plateau. They've got to start going down and down in this next period for putting forth targets. So I think that's going to be really important. I think like if countries make pledges and get close, then we're moving. If countries make pledges and nothing's happening, well, that's going to be a pretty dramatic problem. It'd be a bit dramatic problem for the world, and it'd be a dramatic problem for the Paris regime. I know we had one other. Maybe we're out of time.
Can we squeeze it in? Yeah.
Yeah. Do we have
Sorry,
a mic? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Kevin Hayes. I'm a grad student at Howard University, and my question was, what impact has your legal education, influenced you with the Paris Climate Agreement? And was there any classes or subjects that were, pivotal to it, or was there something that I wish I had taken that to help me with this?
Right. So I think that I always thought that having a law degree and going through law school was a useful thing. I kind of never really thought I was going to end up practicing law, and I did practice law for a while, but my original instinct was right, and I sort of swerved my way into politics and policy, and the legal background was good for that. I think there are in a lot of law schools now have a class or two that relates to climate change, so that can be interesting. I actually taught one when I left the State Department. I taught for a semester at Yale Law School, so I mean, I don't think any of that stuff, including a class on climate change, even is essential. But obviously, if you're interested, that'd be a good thing. But I think, that, and I certainly don't think people need to go to law school no matter what. I would never say that. But it does teach you something about how to think logically, about how to write a memo. You don't literally learn how to write a memo, but you learn about how to get to a point. And so I think that training was useful for me once I got into the political and policy world. And I didn't have the slightest idea in my head, not the slightest idea, that I was going to do anything having to do with the environment. I'd never even heard of climate change. And so, it doesn't matter that much. It matters that you engage, that you try to, learn what you're supposed to be learning, and take classes that are interesting. Take a climate class if there is one, but that's about what I'd say. What I think was really important, actually, I did not, when I was tapped to help to jump into climate change, which was I was in the Clinton White House doing a completely different job called staff secretary, and it's a job where you're sort of like a mile wide and an inch deep. You know a little bit about everything because you're the place that funnels things up to the president. By being in contexts that were political, that were about the intersection of policy and politics, learning and really kind of intuiting the notion that everything's got to be seen through the lens of the art of the possible. You really want to do that? I get that, but we can't do that. So what can we do? All of that kind of thing, I thought, served me incredibly well when I ended up running our international climate negotiations. And the fact that I hadn't done climate until somebody tapped me on the shoulder in 1997, it didn't matter that much. I learned it. But I had this, again, this sense of the way to integrate policy and politics, which I think really was helpful.
Great. Well, thank you all for attending. Thanks everyone online. The COP starts on November 11th, and we will both be there. So more from this space. Thanks for your interest.
Yeah, thank you.